The coffee had gone cold in my hands again. I sat in Margaret's old chair, the one with the faded blue flowers that she'd insisted on keeping even when the springs started to give, watching the morning light filter through our kitchen blinds. Our kitchen. I still called it that. Though she'd been gone 2 years now, and the silence had settled into every corner like dust. The house felt too big these days. 3 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a living room that could seat 12 but rarely saw more than me and the evening news. Margaret used to fill it with her voice, her laughter, the sound of her humming while she cooked Sunday dinner. Now there was just the tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway and the distant hum of traffic on Route 9. I'd built this house with my own hands 43 years ago, back when Tommy was just a baby and Margaret was pregnant with what we hoped would be a little girl. The miscarriage came in the 5th month, but we stayed in the house anyway, poured our love into making it perfect for the family we had. Every beam, every piece of trim, every carefully laid tile in the bathroom, I knew them all like the lines on my palms. The garage still smelled like sawdust and motor oil, though I hadn't worked on a car in months. My tools hung in neat rows on the pegboard Margaret had painted white one spring afternoon, each one outlined in black marker so I'd know where everything belonged. She'd been meticulous that way, organizing our life with the same care she brought to her flower garden. On the workbench sat a bottle of Jameson, still wrapped in the birthday paper Tommy had used 3 months ago. He'd driven over on a Tuesday evening, looking uncomfortable in his pressed khakis and polo shirt, the uniform of his new life in Westchester County. The bottle had been expensive, I could tell by the weight of it and the fancy box, but I hadn't opened it, hadn't even been tempted. Margaret used to say I had a relationship with whiskey that was complicated but respectful. 1 glass on Fridays after a long week, 2 if the week had been particularly trying. Never more. Never before dinner. Never when I was sad. She'd learned to recognize the signs of when grief might make those rules bend, and she'd find ways to keep my hands busy until the urge passed. Now, the bottle sat there like an accusation, gathering dust next to the picture of Tommy at his college graduation. He'd been so proud that day, standing between Margaret and me in his cap and gown, his diploma clutched in his hand like proof that all our sacrifices had meant something. I'd worked double shifts at the plant for 4 years to keep him out of student debt, and Margaret had taken on alterations work in the evenings, her fingers flying over fabric while she watched her stories on the little TV we kept in the sewing room. The sewing room. I hadn't opened that door in 6 months. My phone buzzed against the kitchen table, pulling me back to the present. A text from Helen Morrison, our neighbor of 37 years. "Can you stop by this afternoon? Something I need to tell you about." Helen had been Margaret's closest friend, the kind of woman who knew things before they happened and always seemed to have a casserole ready when life took a difficult turn. If she was reaching out, it wasn't for a casual chat. Helen didn't believe in casual chats, especially not since Margaret's funeral. She understood that some silences were comfortable and some were necessary. I texted back, "Be there at 3. The rest of the morning passed in the familiar rhythm of solitude. I made breakfast for 1, scrambled eggs and toast that tasted like cardboard without Margaret's commentary to season it. I read the newspaper, though nothing seemed to stick. The world kept turning, kept producing headlines and sports scores and weather reports. But it all felt like background noise to the real business of figuring out how to live in a house built for 2 people when only 1 remained. At 2:45, I walked the 100 yards to Helen's front door. Her garden was immaculate as always, roses blooming in neat rows despite the October chill. Margaret had always been slightly jealous of Helen's way with flowers, though she'd never admit it. "Frank," Helen said before I could knock, opening the door with the efficiency of someone who'd been watching through the curtains. She was 76, 2 years older than me, but she moved with the purposeful energy of a woman half her age. Her gray hair was pulled back in its usual bun, and she wore the kind of sensible cardigan that Margaret had always favored. "Helen." I stepped inside, noting the familiar smell of lemon furniture polish and the faint aroma of something baking in the kitchen. "What's this about?" She led me to her living room, gestured toward the sofa, where I'd sat countless times over the decades, usually with Margaret beside me. We'd had dinner here every other Sunday for years, the 4 of us, Helen and her late husband Bill, Margaret and me, talking about everything and nothing until the evening stretched long and comfortable. I've been debating whether to tell you this, Helen said, settling into her chair with the careful movements of someone whose joints had begun to protest. But Margaret would have wanted you to know. The mention of my wife's name tightened something in my chest. Know what? Helen reached for the envelope on her coffee table, held it without opening it. This came to my mailbox by mistake yesterday. Postal service has been getting sloppy lately. She paused, studying my face. It's addressed to me, but it's about Tommy. I waited. Helen had a way of building to important things, and I'd learned not to rush her. It's a wedding invitation, she said quietly. Tommy's getting married next Saturday. The reception is at that fancy country club in White Plains. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my breath catch, my hands tighten on the arms of the chair. That's not possible. Tommy would have told me. Helen's expression was gentle but firm. Would he, Frank? When's the last time you two had a real conversation? I tried to remember. There had been the birthday visit, but that had been brief, awkward. A few phone calls since then, but they'd felt obligatory on both sides. The kind of conversations where you ask about work and the weather, but avoid anything that might matter. Since Margaret's funeral, something had shifted between us. Not anger exactly, but a distance I couldn't seem to bridge. Show me, I said. Helen handed over the envelope. The paper was heavy, expensive, with raised lettering that spoke of money and careful planning. Inside, the invitation was engraved on cream-colored cardstock, with script font that Margaret would have called unnecessarily fancy. Thomas Edward Hamilton and Carolyn Marie Westbrook request the honor of your presence. The date was November 2nd, 9 days away. At the bottom, in smaller print, adults-only event. Limited seating. Regrets only. There's something else, Helen said softly. She pulled out another piece of paper, this one smaller, simpler, a note in Tommy's handwriting. This was tucked inside. Helen, sorry about the confusion with the invitation. As you probably know, Dad hasn't been himself since Mom passed. We thought it would be easier for everyone if this stayed small and quiet. I hope you understand. Tommy. I read it twice, 3 times. Each word felt carefully chosen, deliberately placed. Hadn't been himself. Easier for everyone. Small and quiet. He didn't want me there, I said, the words coming out flatter than I'd intended. He's confused, Frank. Grieving makes people do things they wouldn't normally do. Make decisions they'll regret later. I folded the invitation carefully, slipped it back into the envelope. My hands were steadier than I'd expected them to be. Who's the girl? Carolyn Westbrook. Her family owns that chain of upscale restaurants in Westchester. The Westbrook Group, I think it's called. Money going back 3 generations from what I heard. Helen leaned forward slightly. Frank, I think there might be more to this than just grief. What do you mean? I did a little asking around after I got the invitation. Nothing invasive, just curious. Turns out Carolyn's father has been talking about expanding into real estate development. Lake properties specifically. The words hung in the air between us. Lake properties. Like the cabin Margaret and I had bought 20 years ago on Seneca Lake, the little getaway that had been her pride and joy. The place where we'd planned to retire, where we'd spent every summer weekend for 2 decades. The place Tommy had always called his second home. He wouldn't, I said, but even as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure I believed them. Helen reached over and patted my arm, the kind of gesture Margaret used to make when she knew I was working through something difficult. I'm not saying he would. I'm just saying, maybe it's worth understanding what's really happening here. I stood to leave, the envelope heavy in my jacket pocket. At Helen's door, I turned back. Thank you for telling me. I know it wasn't easy. Margaret would have done the same for me, she said simply. The walk back to my house felt longer than usual. The October air was crisp, carrying the smell of burning leaves and the promise of winter. Inside, the silence seemed heavier than before, weighted with questions I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. I sat at the kitchen table with the invitation spread in front of me, studying every detail, the venue, the time, the careful phrasing that made it clear this was an exclusive event, not the kind of wedding Margaret had always imagined for Tommy. She'd talked about a church ceremony, family gathered from both sides, a reception with dancing and her famous apple cake instead of some fancy catered dessert. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. Tommy's name appeared on the screen. Dad? His voice sounded strained, uncertain. Son? I wanted to call, to talk. A pause. I know Helen showed you the invitation. So he knew. Of course he knew. In a town this size, secrets didn't keep for long. Why, Tommy? Another pause, longer this time. It's complicated. I've got time. Carolyn's family. They're not comfortable with large gatherings right now. Her grandmother is fragile, and they're worried about having too many people who might be emotional. You know how you've been since Mom died. How I've been. As if grief were a character flaw, something to be managed and contained rather than honored. I see, I said. Dad, please don't make this harder than it has to be. We can have dinner after we get back from the honeymoon, just the three of us. It'll be better that way. Better for whom, I wondered, but I didn't ask. Congratulations, son, I said instead. I hope you'll be very happy. Thank you. That means a lot. After I hung up, I sat in Margaret's chair as the afternoon light faded to dusk. The house settled around me with its familiar creaks and sighs, the sounds of a structure that had sheltered our family for over 4 decades. But for the first time since I'd built it, the house felt like it belonged to someone else. I walked to the mantel and picked up our wedding photo, the one Margaret had insisted on displaying even when the frame started to show its age. We looked impossibly young in that picture, full of hope and plans and the absolute certainty that we were building something that would last forever. What do you think about all this? I asked her image, though I already knew what she would have said. Margaret had never believed in burning bridges, but she also hadn't believed in letting people walk all over you in the name of keeping the peace. I set the photo back in its place and walked to the garage. The Jameson bottle sat where I'd left it, still wrapped in birthday paper that now seemed like a mockery. I picked it up, felt its weight in my hands, then set it back down. Instead, I reached for the manila folder on the shelf above the workbench. Inside were all the papers Margaret had organized so carefully before she got sick. The deed to the house, the title to the Lakehouse, insurance policies, her will, and the power of attorney documents we'd never had to use. I spread them on the workbench under the fluorescent light, reading through each document with the careful attention of a man who suddenly understood that he needed to know exactly what he owned and what he didn't. The Lakehouse deed was in both our names, with right of survivorship. Since Margaret's death, it belonged entirely to me. The property taxes were current, the insurance up to date. According to the most recent appraisal, it was worth considerably more than we'd paid for it. As I read, a plan began to form in my mind. Not revenge, Margaret would never have approved of that, but accountability, clarity, a way to make sure that the things we'd built together would honor her memory and protect the values she'd held dear. My son looked me in the eye and said, "This isn't your house anymore," I wrote on a piece of scrap paper, testing out the words. But he had no idea who built it and what I had planned. I folded the paper and slipped it into the manila folder with the rest of our important documents. Tomorrow, I would make some phone calls. Tonight, I would sit with Margaret's memory and begin to understand what it really meant to be the keeper of a legacy. The October wind rattled the garage door, but inside, surrounded by the tools and memories of a life well built, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Purpose. Just one word. Do you feel happy or sad? The morning after Helen showed me the invitation, I woke to the sound of a truck in my driveway. Not Tommy's Honda, I knew that engine like I knew my own heartbeat, but something heavier, more commercial. I padded to the bedroom window in my pajamas and bathrobe, peering through the blinds like some suspicious old man I'd never thought I'd become. A locksmith's van sat next to my mailbox, its yellow lettering cheerful in the early sunlight. A man in coveralls was walking toward my front door, carrying a toolbox that looked serious enough to break into Fort Knox. I dressed quickly and met him on the porch before he could knock. "Morning," he said, consulting a work order on his clipboard. "Here to rekey the locks. Should take about 20 minutes per door." "I didn't call for any locksmith," I said, though something cold was already settling in my stomach. He checked his paperwork again. "Thomas Hamilton called it in yesterday. Said he's the owner, needs the locks changed for security purposes. He looked up at me with the patient expression of a man who dealt with confused homeowners before. "You must be the renter?" The words hit me like a slap. Renter. In the house I'd built with my own hands, on the land Margaret and I had saved for 5 years to buy. "There's been a mistake," I said, keeping my voice level. "I'm Frank Hamilton. This is my house. Thomas, is my son." The locksmith's expression shifted from professional courtesy to uncomfortable confusion. "Well, this is awkward." He scratched his head under his cap. "Look, mister, I got a work order here signed by Thomas Hamilton, and he's paying the bill. Says right here he needs access control for the property." "Let me see that." He handed over the clipboard. There, in Tommy's familiar handwriting, was a request for immediate lock replacement on both the front and back doors. The reason given was security upgrade following tenant concerns. Tenant concerns. "I need to make a phone call," I told the locksmith. "Can you wait 5 minutes?" He glanced at his watch. "I got 3 more jobs today, but sure, 5 minutes." I went inside and dialed Tommy's number. It went straight to voicemail. I tried again. Same result. On the 3rd try, I left a message. "Tommy, there's a locksmith at the house saying you hired him to change my locks. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Call me back." When I returned to the porch, the locksmith was leaning against his van, smoking a cigarette. "Get it sorted out?" "Not exactly." I pulled out my wallet and handed him a 20. "How about you tell Thomas Hamilton that the homeowner refused service and you couldn't complete the job?" He looked at the bill, then at me, then back at the work order. "Sir, I appreciate the tip, but I already took the payment for this job. If I don't complete it, I gotta return the money, and frankly, your son seemed pretty insistent about getting it done today." "What do you mean, insistent?" The man dropped his cigarette and ground it under his boot. "Well, he called 3 times yesterday to make sure I'd be here first thing this morning. Said it was urgent, that there'd been some family issues, and he needed to secure the property. He gave me a look that was part sympathy, part curiosity. Mentioned something about your wife passing and you not handling it well." The cold feeling in my stomach spread to my chest. "He said that?" "Look, Mr. Hamilton, Frank, I don't know what's going on between you and your son, but I got a signed work order and payment in full. Unless you can prove you own this house, I got to do the job I was hired for. I could have gone inside and gotten the deed, could have shown him the mortgage papers from 1981, could have pointed out that my name was on the mailbox and the property tax bills, but something stopped me. Maybe it was pride, or maybe it was the growing realization that this wasn't really about locks at all. "Do what you have to do," I said, and walked inside. From the kitchen window, I watched him work. First the front door, then around to the back. The sound of his drill seemed to echo through the house like gunshots. When he was finished, he knocked on the kitchen door. "All done," he said, handing me a single key on a plain ring. "Your son said to give you this, said he'd be by later with the full set." After the van pulled away, I sat at the kitchen table with that lone key in my palm. It was warm from being in the locksmith's pocket, brass-colored and anonymous. It looked nothing like the keys Margaret and I had carried for 43 years, the ones with the little blue plastic tops she'd bought so we could tell them apart from our car keys in the dark. Those keys were on my keychain right now, useless pieces of metal that would never turn in my locks again. My phone rang. Tommy finally calling back. "Dad, I got your message. I can explain." "I'm listening." A pause. I could hear voices in the background, the sounds of an office or restaurant. Carolyn's father had some concerns about security at the house. With the wedding coming up and all the preparations, he thought it would be better if we controlled access more carefully. Controlled access to my own home. "Dad, please. This isn't personal. It's just practical. You'll get a full set of keys once everything settles down after the honeymoon. It's temporary." What's temporary about changing the locks on a house I've lived in for 43 years? Another pause, longer this time. "Look, I know this seems sudden, but Carolyn's family has experience with property management. They're just trying to help organize things while you're adjusting." There was that word again, adjusting, as if grief were something you could schedule and complete like a home improvement project. "Tommy, I need you to listen to me very carefully. I built this house. Your mother and I paid the mortgage for 27 years. The deed is in my name. You can't just change the locks and call me a renter. Nobody called you a renter, Dad. The locksmith did. Said you told him I was a tenant with concerns. Silence on the other end. I could picture Tommy calculating, trying to find the right words to make this sound reasonable. There's been a miscommunication, he said finally. I'll clear that up. But Dad, the lock change needed to happen. We're storing wedding gifts at the house, expensive items. Carolyn's mother was worried about security. Wedding gifts, here, in the spare bedroom, just temporarily, and some of the catering equipment is being delivered next week. I looked toward the hallway, toward the room Margaret had always kept ready for guests who rarely came. The room with her grandmother's quilt on the bed and the little cross-stitch sampler that read, "Bless this house," on the wall. You're using my house as a storage facility for your wedding. Dad, please don't be dramatic. It's just convenient, and it's only for a few weeks. Convenient for who? For everyone. You're rattling around in all that space anyway. At least this way the house is being useful. The line went quiet. I could hear my own breathing, could hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway, could hear the October wind rattling the windows. All the sounds of a house that had suddenly become foreign to me. I have to go, Tommy said. We'll talk more when I get back from Bermuda. Everything will make more sense then. The dial tone buzzed in my ear like an accusation. I walked through the house room by room, seeing it as if for the first time. In the spare bedroom, boxes were stacked against the far wall. Expensive-looking packages wrapped in white paper with silver bows. Wedding gifts, just as Tommy had said. I counted 12 boxes, all addressed to Thomas Hamilton and Carolyn Westbrook at my address. In the living room, I found more evidence of their occupation. A stack of catering menus on the coffee table, fabric samples scattered across Margaret's good sofa, and a thick binder labeled Westbrook Hamilton Wedding in Carolyn's precise handwriting. I opened it to find seating charts, vendor contracts, and a detailed timeline for the reception. Everything organized with military precision. There was no mention of parents' tables in the seating chart. No space reserved for family from the groom's side. I closed the binder and walked to the mantel, where our wedding photo still sat in its familiar spot. But next to it now was a professional engagement portrait I'd never seen before. Tommy and Carolyn posed in what looked like a rose garden, both dressed in white, smiling the kind of careful smiles you see in magazine advertisements. They looked like strangers. The phone rang again. This time it was Helen. Frank, are you all right? I saw the locksmith van this morning. I'm fine, I lied. Want to come over for lunch? I made too much soup again. Helen's kitchen smelled like chicken and herbs, familiar and comforting in a way my own house no longer did. She served the soup in Margaret's favorite bowls, the blue ones with the little flowers that Helen had inherited when we cleaned out the china cabinet. Tell me what happened, she said, settling across from me at her small table. I told her about the locksmith, about Tommy's explanation, about the wedding gifts stacked in Margaret's spare room. Helen listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding or making small sounds of sympathy. And you believe him? She asked when I finished. About it being temporary? I want to believe him. That's not the same thing. She was right, of course. Helen had a way of cutting through the comfortable lies we tell ourselves. What would Margaret have done? I asked. Helen smiled, the kind of sad smile that carried 40 years of friendship. Margaret would have marched over there and demanded her house key back within the hour, but she also would have tried to understand why her son felt the need to shut her out in the first place. I pushed the soup around in my bowl, not really tasting it. I don't understand any of this, Helen. When did I become someone to be managed instead of included? When you stopped fighting back. The words were gentle but firm, delivered with the authority of someone who'd known me since before Tommy was born. Helen had watched me raise that boy, had seen me teach him to ride a bike and drive a car and throw a curveball. She'd also watched me retreat into myself after Margaret's funeral, watched me become smaller and quieter as the months passed. I don't want to fight with him, I said. Sometimes fighting is just another word for caring enough to demand respect. That evening, I sat in Margaret's chair as darkness settled over the neighborhood. The house felt different now, not just because of the new locks, but because of what they represented. I was a guest in my own home, tolerated rather than welcomed. I thought about the Lakehouse, about the summers when Tommy was young, and we'd spend entire weekends there without any agenda, except fishing and reading and watching Margaret tend her wildflower garden. He'd been happy then, content to help me repair the dock or split wood for the fireplace. We'd talked about everything and nothing, father and son figuring out the world together. When had that changed? When had I become an obstacle rather than a partner in his life? The answer came to me as I sat in the growing darkness. It had started after Margaret's diagnosis. Tommy had begun pulling away even before we lost her, as if he couldn't bear to watch her fade. And after the funeral, instead of drawing closer in shared grief, we'd both retreated to our separate corners, nursing our losses alone. But my retreat had been seen as weakness. His had been seen as growth, as moving forward, as healthy adjustment to life's inevitable changes. I got up and walked to the window, looking out at the street where I had lived for nearly half a century. Mrs. Patterson was walking her little terrier under the streetlights, the same evening ritual she'd maintained for 15 years. The Johnsons had their porch light on, waiting for their daughter to come home from her job at the hospital. Normal life continuing in normal ways. Tomorrow, I would call a lawyer. Not to fight exactly, but to understand what rights I had in this situation that seemed to be spinning beyond my control. Margaret had always said that knowledge was the first step toward wisdom, and right now, I felt like I knew nothing at all about the son I'd raised, or the man he'd become. But first, I would drive out to the Lakehouse. I needed to see if that refuge, at least, was still truly mine. The drive to Seneca Lake took 47 minutes on a good day, but I'd never made it feel longer. Every mile stretched like a question mark. Every turn brought me closer to answers I wasn't sure I wanted to find. The October landscape blurred past my windshield. Corn stubble in harvested fields, maple trees burning red and gold, farmhouses tucked into valleys that looked like postcards from a simpler time. Margaret had loved this drive. She'd insist on taking the scenic route even when we were running late, rolling down her window to breathe in the smell of wood smoke and dying leaves. Life's too short to take shortcuts through beauty, she'd say, and I'd slow down because she was right about most things, especially the ones that mattered. The lake house sat on 2 acres of wooded shoreline, a modest A-frame cabin that we'd bought with money from Margaret's father's estate. It wasn't fancy, 1 bedroom, a loft, a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to maneuver around each other. But it had been ours in a way that felt complete. Every summer weekend for 20 years, we'd packed the car with groceries and books and whatever project I'd been tinkering with in the garage, and we'd disappeared into our own private world. Tommy had loved it here too once. As a boy, he'd spent entire days exploring the creek that ran along the back of the property, building elaborate dam systems with rocks and sticks. He'd fish off the dock with a patience that surprised me, sitting quietly for hours with his line in the water, and his thoughts wherever 8-year-olds keep their thoughts. Margaret would watch him from the kitchen window while she prepared lunch, smiling at the serious concentration on his small face. The gravel driveway looked the same as always, bordered by the white birch trees Margaret had planted our first year. But as I pulled up to the cabin, something felt wrong. Not damaged exactly, but occupied in a way that made my chest tighten. There were tire tracks in the gravel that weren't mine, wider treads, probably from an SUV or truck. The porch swing that Margaret had insisted on hanging, despite my protests about maintenance, was moving slightly in the breeze, but there was a coffee mug sitting on the railing beside it. A mug I didn't recognize, white with some kind of corporate logo. I used my key, the same key I'd carried for 20 years, and pushed open the front door. The smell hit me first. Not the familiar scent of cedar and lake water, and the faint mustiness that old cabins carry like a badge of honor, but something else. Expensive perfume. Coffee that wasn't the brand Margaret and I had always bought. The artificial sweetness of air freshener, trying to mask something I couldn't identify. The living room looked like a staging area for a military operation. The coffee table was covered with papers, contracts, vendor agreements, and what looked like floor plans for some kind of event setup. A laptop computer sat open on Margaret's reading chair, its screen displaying a spreadsheet with columns of numbers and names. I walked closer and read the header, Westbrook Hamilton Wedding Reception, Final Count. They were planning to hold the wedding reception here, at our cabin, without asking me. On the kitchen counter, I found more evidence of their planning. Catering menus from expensive restaurants in Rochester and Syracuse. Wine lists with selections that cost more per bottle than I spent on groceries in a week. a thick folder labeled Venue Preparation, filled with photos of similar lakeside properties that had been transformed for weddings. One photo showed a cabin not unlike ours, but decorated with white tents and strings of lights, with a wooden dance floor built over the lawn and tables arranged along the shoreline. It looked like something from a magazine spread, beautiful and elegant and completely foreign to the quiet refuge Margaret and I had created. I sat down heavily in my old chair, the leather recliner that had molded itself to my shape over 2 decades of Sunday afternoon naps. From here, I could see the dock where Tommy had learned to fish, the fire ring where we'd roasted marshmallows on cool summer evenings, the patch of garden where Margaret had coaxed wildflowers to bloom despite the sandy soil. How could he think this was appropriate? How could he plan to turn our sanctuary into a party venue without even asking? My phone buzzed, a text message from a number I didn't recognize. "Mr. Hamilton, this is Carolyn Westbrook. Tommy gave me your number. I wanted to personally thank you for allowing us to use the lake property for our reception. It means so much to both of us to celebrate where Tommy spent his childhood summers. We'll take excellent care of everything, I promise." I stared at the message for a long moment, reading it twice to make sure I understood. Allowing us to use the property, as if I'd given permission, as if this had been my idea. I scrolled through my recent calls, looking for any conversation with Tommy where he might have asked about using the cabin. Nothing. Our last real discussion had been 3 weeks ago, when he'd called to tell me he was engaged. Even then, the conversation had been brief, formal, more like a business transaction than a son sharing good news with his father. The cabin felt smaller suddenly, crowded with the evidence of decisions made without me. I walked through the bedroom, where someone had moved Margaret's jewelry box from the dresser to make room for what looked like wedding planning binders. In the bathroom, expensive toiletries I didn't recognize sat on the counter next to our old toothbrush holder. Someone had been staying here, recently and regularly, judging by the comfortable way their belongings were distributed through the space. I pulled out my phone and called Tommy. This time, he answered on the second ring. "Dad, what's up?" "I'm at the lake cabin." A pause. I could hear voices in the background, the clatter of dishes or glasses. He was at a restaurant, probably having lunch with Carolyn or her family. "Oh, yeah, I should have mentioned we've been using it for some wedding planning meetings. It's such a peaceful place to think." "Tommy, you can't just use the cabin without asking." I know. I was going to call you about it. Things have just been so crazy with the wedding planning." "Too crazy to ask your father's permission to use his property?" Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted to the tone he used when he thought he was being reasonable about something unreasonable. "Dad, you're never there. The place has been sitting empty for 2 years. We thought you'd be happy that it was getting some use. That's not the point." "What is the point, then?" I looked out the window at the lake, its surface rippling in the afternoon breeze. A loon called from somewhere across the water, its voice lonely and wild. This was where Margaret and I had planned to retire, where we'd imagined growing old together. This was where I came when I needed to remember who I'd been before grief changed everything. The point is that you don't take without asking. The point is that this place has meaning beyond just being convenient for your wedding plans. Of course it has meaning. That's why we want to have the reception here. Where else would we celebrate but at the place that means the most to our family? Our family. I noticed he didn't say my family or even the family, as if the cabin belonged to some collective entity rather than to the man who'd been paying the taxes and maintenance for 20 years. "Did you ask Carolyn's family if they'd be comfortable having a wedding reception at a rustic cabin?" "Actually, they love the idea. Carolyn's mother says it's very authentic, very genuine American family tradition. She's been telling all her friends about our charming family retreat." Charming family retreat. The words made the cabin sound like a quaint bed and breakfast rather than the sanctuary where Margaret had spent her last good summer. "And you didn't think I'd want to know about any of this?" "Dad, honestly, we weren't sure you'd be up for hosting a big celebration. You've been pretty withdrawn since Mom died, and Carolyn's family can be intense. We thought it would be less stressful for you if we just handled everything ourselves." Less stressful for me or less complicated for them? I suspected the answer, but I didn't want to voice it yet. "So, when exactly is this reception supposed to happen?" "Next Saturday night, after the ceremony at the country club. We're having the church service there too. They have a beautiful chapel, very intimate, And then everyone will caravan up to the lake for dinner and dancing. How many people? About 120. I close my eyes. 120 people. Strangers trampling through Margaret's wildflower garden, parking their cars on the grass where we used to spread our blanket for picnics, using our bathroom and kitchen and sacred spaces for a party I hadn't been invited to. Tommy, I need you to listen to me carefully. You cannot have your wedding reception here without my explicit permission, and you do not have my explicit permission. Dad, please. Everything's already arranged. The caterers have been out to survey the property. The rental company is delivering tables and chairs on Friday. The band has the address. We can't change venues 5 days before the wedding. You should have thought of that before you made plans without consulting the property owner. Property owner? His voice rose slightly. Dad, come on. This is family property. This is where I grew up spending summers. This is where Mom taught me to identify birds and where you showed me how to clean fish. You can't suddenly start treating it like some kind of business transaction. I'm not treating it like a business transaction. I'm treating it like what it is, my property which I have every right to control. The silence stretched between us, filled with all the things we weren't saying. Finally, Tommy spoke, his voice quieter, but edged with something I'd never heard before. Fine. We'll figure something else out. But Dad, I want you to know that this hurts. This really hurts. We wanted to honor Mom's memory by celebrating at the place she loved most, and you're turning it into some kind of legal issue. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. I was the one being unreasonable. I was the one turning love into law, sentiment into selfishness. Your mother would have wanted to be asked, I said quietly. Your mother would have wanted her son to be happy on his wedding day. Both things were true, and that was the problem. After we hung up, I sat in the cabin as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, painting everything golden and melancholy. I could picture it as they'd planned it. White tents on the lawn, tables along the shoreline, music floating across the water. It would have been beautiful, probably. Margaret would have loved seeing the place filled with celebration and joy. But she would have wanted to be part of planning it. She would have wanted to choose the flowers and approve the menu and fuss over every detail the way she'd fussed over Tommy's birthday parties when he was small. She would have wanted to wear her good blue dress and dance with her son under the stars. Instead, she was 3 years in the ground, and her son was using her memory as justification for taking what he wanted without asking. I walked out to the dock and sat on the edge, my feet dangling in the cool water. Across the lake, I could see other cabins tucked between the trees, smoke rising from chimneys, the warm glow of windows as families settled in for dinner. Normal people living normal lives, probably not wondering whether their children still saw them as parents or just as obstacles to be managed. The sun was setting by the time I drove back to town, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink that Margaret would have called God showing off. But the beauty felt distant, like something I was observing from behind glass. At home, the new locks felt strange under my fingers. Inside, I found more wedding gifts stacked in the hallway, more evidence that my house had become a storage facility for a celebration I wouldn't attend. I poured myself a glass of water and sat at the kitchen table with the manila folder of documents I'd studied the night before. Property deeds, insurance policies, the careful paperwork of a life lived responsibly. Tomorrow, I would call a lawyer. Not to wage war against my son, but to understand exactly what belonged to me and what didn't. Because clearly, we had very different ideas about ownership, family, and respect. And if Tommy thought he could take what he wanted simply because he assumed I was too broken to fight back, he was about to learn something important about the man who had raised him. Some lessons, Margaret used to say, are only learned the hard way. Marcus Henley's law office sat above the old Woolworth building on Main Street, reached by a narrow staircase that creaked under my boots like a complaint about the weight of human troubles. I'd climbed these stairs exactly 3 times in 40 years. Once to review the purchase agreement when Margaret and I bought the Lakehouse, once to update our wills after Tommy graduated college, and once more to handle Margaret's estate after the funeral. Marcus had been handling legal matters for families like ours since before Tommy was born, the kind of lawyer who knew everybody's business but kept it to himself, who charged fair rates and returned phone calls the same day. His waiting room smelled like old leather and fresh coffee, with diplomas on the walls dating back to when Nixon was president. "Frank," he said, standing up from behind a desk covered in neat stacks of papers. Marcus was my age, maybe a year older, with silver hair and the kind of steady handshake that came from dealing with people's worst problems for 5 decades. "I was sorry to hear about the situation with Tommy. Helen Morrison called me yesterday, said you might need some guidance." Of course Helen had called. In a town like ours, news traveled faster than gossip, and both moved at the speed of light. "I'm not sure what I need," I admitted, settling into the chair across from his desk. "But I know I need to understand my options." Marcus pulled out a yellow legal pad and uncapped an old fountain pen. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." So I did. The hidden wedding invitation, the locksmith, the cabin being used without permission, the wedding gifts stacked in my spare bedroom. Marcus listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in his careful handwriting. "And you haven't given him power of attorney?" he asked when I finished. "No. Margaret and I set up mutual power of attorney, but after she died, I never transferred it to Tommy." "Good. That makes things simpler." Marcus leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "Frank, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Do you think your son is acting out of genuine concern for your welfare, or is there something else driving this?" I thought about the expensive wedding venue, about Carolyn's family and their restaurant empire, about the way Tommy's voice had changed when he talked about property management and security concerns. "I think he's gotten some advice from people who see my assets differently than I do." Marcus nodded slowly. "The Westbrook family has a reputation for being strategically minded about financial matters. Old money tends to think in terms of portfolios rather than sentiment." He made another note. "Here's what we're dealing with, legally speaking. Your house is titled solely in your name since Margaret's death. Your Lakehouse is the same. Tommy has no legal claim to either property, regardless of what he might think or what his in-laws might have told him. So I can evict him? You can deny him access, yes. But Frank, there's a difference between what you can do legally and what you should do practically. If you want to maintain any relationship with your son, we need to think strategically." Marcus walked to his filing cabinet and pulled out a thick folder labeled Hamilton F&M. Inside were copies of all the documents I'd signed over the years, plus others I'd forgotten about. "Let me show you something interesting," he said, spreading papers across his desk. "When you and Margaret bought the Lakehouse, you set it up as a life estate with remainder to Tommy. Do you remember that?" I stared at the deed, trying to recall conversations from 20 years ago. Margaret insisted on it. She wanted to make sure Tommy would inherit the property without probate complications. "Exactly. Which means that currently, you hold the life estate, you own and control the property during your lifetime. But Tommy has a remainder interest. When you die, ownership transfers automatically to him." The implications settled over me like cold water. "So, he already has a legal interest in the cabin." "A future interest, yes, but not current ownership rights. He can't use the property without your permission any more than he could use your house without permission." Marcus pulled out another document. "However, there's something else we need to consider. Margaret's will included a provision that I drafted at her request. She was concerned about making sure you were taken care of in your old age." He handed me a copy of Margaret's will. I'd read it after her funeral, but grief had made the legal language blur together meaninglessly. Now, reading it again with clearer eyes, I found the section Marcus was referring to. "It is my express wish that our son, Thomas Edward Hamilton, shall honor his moral and ethical obligations to care for his father, Franklin James Hamilton, in his declining years, with the understanding that failure to do so may result in modification of the inheritance provisions contained herein." "What does that mean practically?" I asked. "It means Margaret gave you grounds to modify Tommy's inheritance if he fails to honor his obligations to you. The language is deliberately broad. Moral and ethical obligations could encompass everything from basic respect to actual caregiving." I read the passage again, hearing Margaret's voice in every carefully chosen word. Even in death, she'd been thinking 3 steps ahead, protecting me from possibilities I'd been too trusting to imagine. Could I disinherit him? You could modify the terms of his inheritance, yes. You couldn't completely disinherit him from the Lakehouse because of the life estate structure, but you could add conditions to that inheritance. Require him to maintain a relationship with you, for instance. or demonstrate that he's acting in your best interests rather than his own. Marcus pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began sketching out options. Here's what I'm thinking. We can't undo the wedding plans at this point. Too much money involved, too many people invited. But we can make sure that going forward, Tommy understands exactly where he stands. How? First, we send a formal letter to both Tommy and the Westbrook family, clarifying property ownership and use rights. Professional, but friendly. Think of it as setting boundaries rather than declaring war. Second, we modify your will to include specific conditions on Tommy's inheritance. He wants to treat family property as his personal assets? Fine, but he needs to understand that inheritance is a privilege, not a right. Marcus opened his laptop and began typing. I can have the letter drafted today and the will amendments ready by the end of the week. The question is, what conditions do you want to set? I thought about the conversation at the cabin, about Tommy's dismissive tone when he'd talked about me being withdrawn and not up for hosting. I thought about the locksmith calling me a renter in my own house. I want him to understand that respect isn't optional, I said finally. That family isn't just about convenience and inheritance. That his mother's memory deserves better than being used to justify taking what he wants. Understood. Let me suggest something specific. We include a provision requiring him to maintain regular, meaningful contact with you, monthly visits, holiday celebrations, involvement in major life decisions. If he fails to meet those obligations for more than 6 months, his inheritance gets redirected. Redirected where? Marcus smiled for the first time since I'd arrived. That's the beauty of it. You get to decide. Could be a charity Margaret cared about. Could be a scholarship fund in her name. Could be anything that honors her values better than a son who takes his father for granted. The idea took shape in my mind like a photograph developing. Margaret had always supported the local veterans organization, had spent countless hours organizing their annual fundraising dinner. She'd grown up in a military family, understood the sacrifice that service required. The veterans of foreign wars, I said. Margaret always said they got the least help and needed it the most. Perfect. So, the new provision reads something like this. Thomas Hamilton inherits the Lakehouse property contingent upon maintaining a meaningful relationship with his surviving parent, as evidenced by regular contact and inclusion in family decisions. Failure to meet these obligations for a period exceeding 6 months results in the property being transferred to the local VFW in Margaret Hamilton's memory. Marcus typed as he spoke, the keys clicking with the rhythm of decisions being made permanent. This isn't about punishment, Frank. This is about accountability. Tommy can have his inheritance, but he needs to earn it by being a son instead of just an heir. We spent another hour working through the details. The letter to Tommy and the Westbrooks would be cordial but firm. One-time permission for the wedding reception, with clear understanding that future use required advance approval. The will modifications would be more comprehensive, including not just the Lakehouse, but also provisions for the family home and other assets. One more thing, Marcus said as I prepared to leave. Consider documenting your interactions with Tommy going forward. Dates, time, substance of conversations. If this escalates and he tries to claim you're mentally incompetent or being manipulated, you'll want evidence of your decision-making process. The suggestion stung, but I understood the logic. In a world where sons could have their father's locks changed and call it security, anything was possible. Walking down Main Street after leaving Marcus's office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Control. Not over Tommy's choices, those were his to make, but over my own responses to them. I wasn't a victim in this situation. I was a property owner with rights and options, and I had every intention of using both. I stopped at Henderson's Hardware to pick up a composition notebook, the kind kids used in school with black and white marble covers. If I was going to document my interactions with my son, I might as well do it properly. At the diner on the corner, I ordered coffee and apple pie and opened the notebook to the first page. At the top, I wrote, Record of Communications, Franklin Hamilton and Thomas Hamilton, October 2019. Below that, I began documenting everything I could remember from the past week. The locksmith's visit, Tommy's explanations, the discovery of the wedding planning materials at the cabin. Each entry included date, time, witnesses if any, and exact quotes where I could remember them. It felt strange, reducing my relationship with my son to a legal record. But as I wrote, patterns emerged that I hadn't noticed before. The way Tommy's explanations always positioned him as the reasonable party and me as someone who needed management. The way he framed his decisions as being in my best interest, even when they clearly benefited him more than me. The way he'd learned to use Margaret's memory as a weapon against my objections. By the time I finished writing, my coffee was cold and the diner was filling with the dinner crowd. I paid my check and walked home through the gathering dusk, the notebook tucked under my arm like a shield. Inside my house, whatever locks were on the doors, I found 3 more wedding gifts stacked by the front door. But instead of feeling invaded, I felt prepared. Tomorrow, Marcus would send his letters. By the end of the week, Tommy would understand that his father wasn't as broken as he'd assumed. I made myself dinner and ate it at the kitchen table, Margaret's chair empty across from me, but her presence somehow stronger than it had been in months. She would have approved of what I'd done today. Margaret had always believed in clear communication, in treating people with respect, but expecting the same in return. As I washed the dishes, I thought about the wedding reception that would happen at our cabin in 5 days. Tommy and Carolyn dancing under the stars, her family celebrating their strategic acquisition of authentic American family tradition. It would be beautiful, probably, but it would also be the last time anyone used our sacred place without asking permission first. Some lessons, Margaret used to say, are only learned the hard way. And some teachers, I was beginning to understand, had to be fathers who'd spent too long being taken for granted. The composition notebook lay open on the kitchen counter, waiting for tomorrow's entries. Whatever came next, I would be ready to document it. And more importantly, I would be ready to respond to it on my own terms. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times in the hallway, marking another day in what was becoming a very different life than the one I'd been living just a week ago. But for the first time since Margaret's death, different felt like it might be better. The letter from Marcus arrived at Tommy's apartment on a Thursday morning, delivered by certified mail in a manila envelope that looked official enough to command attention. I knew this because Helen had volunteered to drive past his building and confirmed that the postal slip was tucked into his mailbox by 10:30. "You're not spying," she'd assured me when I protested her reconnaissance mission. "You're gathering intelligence." Margaret would have done the same thing. By noon, my phone was ringing. "Dad, what the hell is this?" Tommy's voice carried the tight control of someone trying not to shout in a public place. I was in my garage, organizing tools that didn't need organizing, but the familiar rhythm of putting things in their proper places helped me stay calm. "I assume you're referring to the letter from my attorney." "Your attorney, Dad? Since when do you need an attorney to talk to your own son?" "Since my own son started changing my locks and using my property without permission." A pause. I could hear traffic in the background, the distant hum of what sounded like construction equipment. He was probably outside his office building, pacing on the sidewalk the way he used to do as a teenager when he was working up the courage to ask for something he knew I'd refuse. "The letter says I have to get written permission to use the lake cabin for any future events. Written permission, like I'm some kind of tenant. The letter says exactly what it means to say. And this part about establishing clear boundaries regarding property ownership and usage rights. What's that supposed to mean?" I set down the wrench I'd been holding and walked to the window overlooking the backyard. Margaret's flower garden was brown now, dormant until spring, but I could still see the careful pattern she'd laid out in her final summer. Roses along the fence, delphiniums in the center, bachelor's buttons scattered like blue confetti throughout. "It means that property has owners, Tommy, and owners get to decide how their property is used." "This is insane. You're treating family like it's some kind of business transaction." "No, son. You did that when you had my locks changed without asking. I'm just making sure everyone understands the terms and conditions." Another pause, longer this time. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted to the tone he used when he thought he was being reasonable about something fundamentally unreasonable. "Dad, I think you're overreacting. Maybe we should sit down with Carolyn and her parents, work this out face to face. They're very reasonable people. I'm sure once you get to know them, I'm sure they are reasonable, but this isn't about them. This is about you forgetting that respect goes both ways in a family. I haven't forgotten anything. I've been trying to protect you." "From what?" "From having to deal with all the stress and complications of hosting a big event. from having to interact with people you don't know during a time when you're still grieving, from having to make decisions about things you don't understand. Things I don't understand. The phrase hung in the air like smoke, acrid and revealing. This was how he saw me now, as an elderly man too grief-stricken and confused to manage his own affairs. Tommy, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am 74 years old. I built 2 successful businesses from nothing, raised a son, maintained a 47-year marriage, and buried a wife. I understand more than you think. Of course you do. I didn't mean... You meant exactly what you said. You think I'm incompetent. You think grief has made me weak and confused. You think you need to manage me like I'm some kind of problem to be solved. Silence on the other end. In the distance, I could hear the sound of children playing in the elementary school playground 3 blocks away, their voices carrying on the crisp October air. That's not true, Tommy said finally, but his protest lacked conviction. Then prove it. Come to the house tonight. Bring Carolyn if you want. We'll sit down like adults and discuss how this is going to work going forward. Dad, we're supposed to have dinner with Carolyn's parents tonight. It's been planned for weeks. Then tomorrow. Tomorrow we have the final cake tasting, and then the rehearsal dinner planning meeting. I leaned against the garage doorframe, watching a squirrel bury acorns in Margaret's flower bed. The little creature worked with single-minded determination, preparing for winter with the kind of practical foresight that seemed to be missing from my son's approach to family relationships. Find time, Tommy, or the answer to any future requests is no. After I hung up, I spent the rest of the afternoon calling various service providers. The security company that monitored the Lakehouse alarm system, the propane company that filled the tank for the cabin's generator, the landscaping service that maintained the access road. Each conversation was brief and professional. Any service calls or changes to existing arrangements would require written authorization from me personally, starting immediately. By evening, I had effectively created a moat around the Lakehouse that Tommy couldn't cross without my permission. Not out of spite, but out of necessity. If he wanted to use family property, he could learn to ask family permission. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. I was finishing breakfast when a silver BMW pulled into my driveway, driven by a woman I'd never seen before. She was probably my age, well-dressed in the way that suggested money without ostentation, and she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to being taken seriously. I met her at the front door before she could knock. "Mr. Hamilton?" She extended a manicured hand. "I'm Patricia Westbrook, Carolyn's mother. I wonder if we might have a word." I invited her into the living room, offered coffee that she declined with a polite smile. She settled into Margaret's chair with the ease of someone comfortable in other people's homes, and I took my usual spot on the sofa. "I'll come straight to the point," she said, setting her purse on the coffee table with deliberate care. "Thomas tells me there's been some confusion about the wedding reception arrangements." No confusion on my part. Her smile remained perfectly in place, but something shifted behind her eyes. "Mr. Hamilton, may I call you Frank? I understand you've been through a difficult time since your wife's passing. Grief can make us protective of things that remind us of better days." The words were carefully chosen, delivered with practiced sympathy. But the message was clear. I was being irrational, and she was being patient with my irrationality. "Mrs. Westbrook, let me be equally direct. My Lakehouse is not available for your daughter's wedding reception. But surely you understand how much this means to the children. They've planned everything around that venue. The catering, the flowers, the music, everything has been coordinated for a lakeside celebration. Then they should have asked the property owner before making those arrangements." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow to understand. "Frank, these young people have been under enormous stress planning this wedding. Thomas has been so worried about you, living alone in this big house, managing all these properties by yourself. When he mentioned that the lake cabin was just sitting empty, well, naturally, we thought it would be wonderful to bring some joy back to a place that must hold such sad memories now. The manipulation was skillful, I had to admit. Paint me as a lonely old man whose property was going to waste, suggest that the wedding would somehow honor Margaret's memory, imply that Tommy's concern for my welfare justified taking what he wanted without asking. "Mrs. Westbrook, that cabin holds 40 years of happy memories. I'm not interested in turning it into a party venue." "Of course not a party venue. a celebration of family, a new beginning that honors the past while embracing the future. She paused, studying my face. I understand you've hired an attorney. I've consulted with legal counsel, yes. That seems rather adversarial for a family matter. Family matters are the kind that most often require legal clarity. She was quiet for a moment, and I could almost see her recalibrating her approach. When she spoke again, her voice carried a different quality, less sympathy, more steel. Frank, I'm going to be honest with you. My husband and I have invested considerable money in this wedding. The catering alone cost more than most people spend on a car. We've invited 120 guests, many of them business associates and family friends who've traveled significant distances to be here. The reception cannot simply be moved to another venue 5 days before the event. Then you should have secured the venue before making those investments. We were told by your son that the property was available. My son was mistaken about his authority to make that commitment. Patricia Westbrook's perfectly composed expression finally cracked slightly. Mr. Hamilton, are you seriously going to let your pride destroy your son's wedding? Mrs. Westbrook, are you seriously suggesting that I should give up my property rights to salvage your poor planning? The silence stretched between us, filled with the tick of the grandfather clock and the distant sound of a lawnmower 2 houses down. Finally, she stood, smoothing her skirt with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. I hope you'll reconsider, she said, for Thomas's sake, if not for ours. After she left, I sat in the quiet living room and thought about the conversation. Patricia Westbrook had revealed more than she'd intended. This wasn't just about venue convenience or honoring family tradition. This was about money and appearances, and the kind of people who believed that other people's property was available for their use if they needed it badly enough. My phone rang an hour later. Tommy again, but this time his voice carried a different quality, less pleading, more demanding. Dad, Carolyn's mother came to see you this morning. She did. She said you were completely unreasonable, completely inflexible. I was completely consistent with what I told you yesterday. Dad, do you have any idea what you're doing? Do you understand what this is going to cost us? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Did I understand what my decision would cost them? Yes, I understood perfectly. The question was whether Tommy understood what his assumptions had cost me. Son, let me ask you something. When you and Carolyn were making these elaborate plans for the Lakehouse, did you ever once consider inviting me to be part of the planning? Did you ever think I might want to help choose the flowers, or approve the menu, or have any say in how my own property was going to be used? We thought it would be better if we handled everything ourselves. Better for whom? No answer. You want to use the cabin, Tommy? Here's what that looks like. You and Carolyn come to the house tomorrow evening for dinner. We sit down like a family and discuss what kind of celebration would honor your mother's memory and respect the place where she was happiest. You listen to my suggestions. You include me in your decisions. You treat me like a father instead of like an obstacle to your plans. Dad, it's too late for that. Everything's already arranged. Then everything will have to be unarranged. I hung up before he could respond. Outside, the October afternoon was crisp and bright, the kind of day Margaret would have called perfect for working in the garden. Instead, I was working on something she would have approved of even more, teaching our son that family relationships require mutual respect, not just mutual convenience. The composition notebook lay open on the kitchen counter, and I added another entry. October 25th, 10:30 a.m. Visit from Patricia Westbrook. Attempted emotional manipulation and guilt regarding wedding reception venue. Made clear that property usage requires owner permission. Tomorrow would bring new attempts at persuasion, new arguments about reasonableness and family obligation. But tonight, I had something more important to do. I was going to drive to the Lakehouse and spend an evening in the place Margaret had loved most, remembering why some things were worth protecting even when protection came at a cost. Some boundaries, I was learning, were drawn not with anger, but with love. Saturday morning arrived gray and drizzling, the kind of weather that makes October feel like a warning about November. I stood at my kitchen window with a cup of coffee, watching the rain bead on the glass and thinking about wedding receptions that wouldn't happen at lakeside cabins. Tommy hadn't called back after our conversation on Thursday. Neither had Carolyn or her mother. The silence felt deliberate, calculated, the kind of quiet that comes before a storm rather than after one. I'd dealt with enough contractors over the years to recognize the signs. They were regrouping, finding another angle of approach. At 10 o'clock, Helen knocked on my door, carrying a covered casserole dish, and wearing the expression of someone bearing news she wasn't sure how to deliver. "Thought you might want some company this morning," she said, settling the dish on my kitchen counter, "and I thought you should know what people are saying." I poured her coffee without asking if she wanted it. Helen and I had moved beyond the formalities of hospitality years ago. "What are people saying?" "That you're being unreasonable, that grief has made you bitter, that you're punishing Tommy for moving on with his life while you're stuck in the past." She paused, studying my face. "Margaret always said you were tougher than people gave you credit for. Am I being unreasonable, Helen?" She considered the question while adding cream to her coffee, stirring with the deliberate care of someone buying time to formulate an honest answer. "You're being a father," she said finally. "Sometimes that's the same thing." At 11:30, a florist's van pulled into my driveway. The driver, a young woman with paint-stained jeans and tired eyes, approached my door carrying a clipboard and looking confused. "Mr. Hamilton, I'm supposed to pick up arrangements for the Westbrook-Hamilton wedding reception. The Lakehouse venue." I looked at the work order on her clipboard. 12 centerpieces, 6 standing arrangements, assorted garlands for rustic lakeside ceremony enhancement. Total cost, $2,140. "There's been a change of venue," I told her. "You'll need to contact the bride's family for the new delivery address." "Oh." She frowned at her paperwork. "This is awkward. These flowers were specifically designed for outdoor lakeside display. They won't work as well in a traditional indoor venue." "Then I suggest you discuss that with whoever hired you." After she left, I called Marcus. He answered on the second ring, sounding like a man who'd been expecting my call. "How are you holding up, Frank? I'm getting visited by vendors who think they're picking up wedding supplies from my Lakehouse. Apparently, nobody told them about the change of venue." "That's because there hasn't been one. I did some checking yesterday. The Westbrook family has been calling around to every event venue within 50 miles, looking for Saturday availability. Nobody has space for 120 people on one day's notice." The implications settled over me like cold rain. They hadn't found an alternative venue because they were still planning to use mine. "What do you think they're going to do?" "I think they're going to show up at your cabin this evening and hope you don't have the heart to turn away a bride on her wedding day." I set down my coffee cup, suddenly understanding the quiet of the past 2 days. They hadn't been accepting my decision. They'd been working around it. Can they do that? Legally, no. You're the property owner, and you've explicitly denied permission. But, Frank, we're not dealing with legal logic here. We're dealing with people who've invested significant money and emotional energy in a plan that requires your cooperation. And if I don't cooperate, then you'll be the grandfather who ruined his son's wedding. That's how the story will be told, and that's how it will be remembered. I walked to the living room and stood in front of Margaret's photograph. She was smiling in that picture, the genuine smile she wore when she was truly happy rather than just being polite. It had been taken at Tommy's high school graduation, and her eyes carried all the pride and hope a mother feels when she watches her child step into adulthood. What would she want me to do? The question had tormented me for days, but now the answer seemed clear. Margaret would want me to protect what mattered while finding a way to preserve what could be saved. She would want me to be strong without being cruel, firm without being vindictive. "Marcus, what if I offered a compromise?" "What kind of compromise?" "What if I let them have their reception, but on my terms, my venue, my rules, my conditions?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. "That's either very generous or very devious. Which is it?" "Maybe both." I spent the afternoon preparing. First, I drove to the Lakehouse and walked through every room, making notes about what needed to be protected or secured. Margaret's jewelry box went into the bedroom closet. The good china we kept in the kitchen hutch got wrapped and stored in the pantry. The photo albums and personal mementos went into a locked trunk in the bedroom. Then I set up what Margaret would have called house rules for the evening. I typed them on the old computer in the cabin's loft, printed them on the sturdy cardstock I kept for signs, and posted copies in the kitchen, bathroom, and main living area. "Welcome to the Hamilton family Lakehouse. Tonight's celebration is held in memory of Margaret Hamilton, who loved this place and believed that family gatherings should honor both tradition and respect. House rules for tonight's event. 1. No smoking anywhere on the property. 2. No shoes inside the cabin. 3. Music ends at 10 p.m. out of consideration for neighbors. 4. All trash must be bagged and removed from the property. 5. Any damage to property or belongings will be charged to the event organizers. 6. The cabin interior is off limits except for bathroom use. 7. All guests will respect the memory of Margaret Hamilton and the sanctity of this family retreat. By the authority of Franklin J. Hamilton, property owner. At the bottom, I added one final line. Violation of these rules will result in immediate termination of the event. At 4 o'clock, the first vendor arrived, a catering truck, followed by a rental company van loaded with tables and chairs. I met them at the end of the driveway. Gentlemen, I'm Frank Hamilton, the property owner. You're welcome to proceed with your setup, but I need you to understand the conditions. I handed each driver a copy of the house rules and watched them read. The caterer, a middle-aged man with the weathered face of someone who'd worked outdoor events for years, nodded approvingly. Fair enough, Mr. Hamilton. We've worked plenty of private property events. These rules are actually pretty reasonable. Good, because they're non-negotiable. By 6 o'clock, the transformation was remarkable. White tents dotted the lawn, strung with lights that would glow like stars once darkness fell. Tables covered in cream-colored linens surrounded the makeshift dance floor. Flowers, the ones I'd redirected from my house that morning, created splashes of color throughout the setup. It looked like something from a magazine, beautiful and elegant and completely at odds with the rustic simplicity Margaret and I had cultivated over 40 years. At 6:30, cars began arriving, expensive sedans and SUVs that looked out of place on our gravel road, carrying guests dressed in clothes that probably cost more than I spent on necessities in a month. I stood on the cabin's front porch, wearing my best suit, the one I'd worn to Margaret's funeral, and greeted each group with polite formality. Welcome to the Hamilton family Lakehouse. Please observe the posted house rules for everyone's enjoyment and safety. Some guests smiled and thanked me. Others looked confused, clearly not understanding why the groom's father was acting like a host rather than a guest. A few seemed annoyed by the rules, particularly the one about removing shoes before entering the cabin. Tommy and Carolyn arrived at 7, she in a flowing white dress that complemented the lakeside setting perfectly. He in a tuxedo that made him look like a stranger playing the role of my son. They stood at the edge of the property for several minutes, apparently debating their approach. Finally, they walked over to where I stood by the cabin steps. Dad, Tommy said, his voice carefully neutral. Thank you for allowing this. You're welcome. Carolyn stepped forward, extending her hand. Mr. Hamilton, I want you to know how much it means to us to celebrate here. This place is so important to Tommy, and I can see why. She was beautiful, I had to admit. Not just physically, though she was certainly that, but in the way she carried herself, the way she spoke with careful consideration of each word. I could understand why Tommy had fallen in love with her. I could also understand why her family thought they could manage the inconvenient details of other people's lives. Your mother would have loved seeing you married here, I told Tommy, and meant it. She always said this place brought out the best in people. For a moment, his composed expression flickered, revealing something that might have been the boy I remembered. I miss her, he said quietly. So do I. The reception unfolded with the smooth efficiency of professional event planning. Cocktails were served on the lawn as the sun set behind the pines, painting everything golden and soft. Dinner followed, with tables full of people who laughed and talked, and seemed genuinely happy to celebrate the young couple's new beginning. I didn't join the festivities. Instead, I sat on the cabin's front porch, close enough to observe, but separate from the celebration. Several guests approached me during the evening, curious about the house rules, complimentary about the property, polite in the way that wealthy people learn to be polite to those who control things they want. Patricia Westbrook found me around 8:30, carrying a glass of champagne and wearing an expression of careful diplomacy. Frank, I owe you an apology. When I came to see you yesterday, I was stressed about the wedding arrangements. I may have said things that sounded presumptuous. You may have. She settled into the porch swing beside my chair, uninvited but not unwelcome. This is a beautiful place. I can see why it means so much to your family. It meant everything to my wife. Tommy talks about the summers he spent here as a child, swimming in the lake, fishing with his grandfather, helping his grandmother with her flower garden. I looked at her sharply. Tommy never knew my parents. They died before he was born. Patricia's carefully composed expression faltered. Oh, I thought he mentioned grandparents. He was talking about Margaret's parents. They lived in Syracuse, never came to the lake. I see. She sipped her champagne, clearly trying to recover from her mistake. Well, regardless, he has wonderful memories of this place. Some of them are even true. The conversation died there, killed by the growing understanding that Tommy had been telling stories about his childhood that painted it in colors more romantic than reality had provided. Not lies exactly, but embellishments designed to fit the narrative that Carolyn's family wanted to hear. At 9:45, I stood and walked to the bandstand where a quartet was playing jazz standards for the handful of couples still dancing. Gentlemen, you have 15 minutes remaining per the house rules. Please plan your final songs accordingly. The lead musician nodded professionally. Understood, sir. Thank you for the heads up. At exactly 10 o'clock, the music stopped. Some guests grumbled, but most began the process of gathering purses and saying goodbyes. The vendors worked with quiet efficiency, breaking down equipment and loading trucks with the practice of people who'd done this hundreds of times. By 11:30, the property was empty except for Tommy, Carolyn, and me. We stood in the sudden quiet, surrounded by the evidence of celebration, trampled grass, scattered flower petals, the lingering scent of expensive perfume and catered food. Thank you, Carolyn said, her voice soft in the darkness. It was beautiful. It was, I agreed. Your mother would have been proud. Tommy stepped forward, and for a moment I thought he might embrace me. Instead, he extended his hand for a formal handshake. I know this wasn't easy for you, Dad. I know we should have asked differently. Yes, you should have. Will you be okay with how things worked out? I looked around the property, at the place Margaret and I had loved for 40 years, now forever changed by this single evening. It would never be just ours again. Tonight had made it part of Tommy's history, part of his marriage story, part of the narrative he would tell his children about their grandparents' legacy. I'll be fine with it, I said. But Tommy, this was the last time anything like this happens without my full involvement from the beginning. He nodded, understanding that this had been both a gift and a warning. After they left, I sat on the dock and listened to the lake lap against the pilings. The night was clear now, stars reflecting on the dark water like scattered diamonds. Somewhere across the lake, a loon called, its voice wild and lonely. Tomorrow, I would clean up the remaining traces of the celebration. I would restore the cabin to its quiet simplicity, secure in the knowledge that I had protected what mattered while allowing what was necessary. Tonight, I simply sat with Margaret's memory and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. The satisfaction of a father who had found a way to be strong without being cruel, firm without being vindictive. Some compromises I was learning were really victories in disguise. The cleanup took 3 days. I'd expected the vendors to handle most of it. Professional event companies usually left properties in better condition than they'd found them. But this had been different. This had been personal, and personal celebrations leave traces that go deeper than scattered napkins and champagne flutes forgotten under bushes. The lawn bore scars from high heels and tent stakes. Margaret's carefully tended flower beds showed trampled edges where guests had wandered beyond the designated areas. The dock where I'd taught Tommy to fish now carried scratch marks from dress shoes and the lingering scent of expensive perfume that seemed to cling to the wooden planks like an accusation. I worked methodically, the way Margaret had taught me to approach overwhelming tasks, one small section at a time, one problem solved before moving to the next. I reseeded the damaged grass, reset the border stones around the flower beds, scrubbed the dock until it smelled like lake water and honest wood again. By Wednesday afternoon, the physical evidence was gone. The emotional residue would take longer to fade. I was sitting on the porch swing, drinking coffee from Margaret's favorite mug, the blue one with the chip on the handle that she'd refused to let me replace, when my phone rang. Tommy's number. Dad, I wanted to call and thank you again for Saturday night. Carolyn and I both appreciate what you did. You're welcome. A pause. I could hear traffic in the background, the distant hum of his office building's air conditioning system. He was at work, probably stealing a few minutes between meetings to make a call he'd been putting off. I also wanted to talk about what happens next, with the house, with the Lakehouse, with everything. What about everything? Well, Carolyn and I have been discussing our living situation. The apartment in town is really too small now that we're married, and with her starting the new job at her father's company, we'll need more space for entertaining. The words carried a familiar weight. I'd heard this tone before, the careful preamble that preceded a request I wasn't going to want to grant. And we were wondering if you'd consider downsizing, moving somewhere more manageable. There are some really nice senior communities in the area, places where you wouldn't have to worry about maintenance or yard work or being alone if something happened. I set down my coffee mug, watching the lake through the porch screens. A family of ducks paddled near the shoreline, the mother leading her half-grown offspring in a neat line toward whatever destination ducks considered important. Tommy, are you asking me to move out of my house so you and Carolyn can move in? Not asking exactly, just exploring options for everyone's benefit. Whose benefit? Well, yours primarily. Dad, you're 74 years old. That's a big house to maintain, and you're living there all alone. Wouldn't it be nice to have neighbors your own age, activities planned for you, meals provided, no more worrying about furnace repairs or roof maintenance or snow removal? I listened to him paint a picture of institutional living dressed up as convenience, of surrender disguised as practicality. It was skillfully done. He'd learned the art of persuasion from someone, probably Carolyn's family, who understood how to make taking sound like giving. And what would happen to the house? We'd take care of it, of course, keep it in the family, maybe eventually raise our children there, in the same rooms where I grew up. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Continuity across generations? What about the Lakehouse? Another pause. Well, that's more complicated. Maintaining two properties is expensive, and honestly, we're not sure we'd use the cabin enough to justify keeping it. We've talked about maybe selling it and using the proceeds to help with your senior living expenses. The casual way he discussed dismantling 40 years of my life took my breath away. Not anger. I was beyond anger now. Something colder and more final. I see, I said. Dad, we don't have to decide anything right now. It's just something to think about. Plan for the future while we're all healthy and able to make good decisions together. Together. Exactly, as a family. I watched the ducks reach whatever destination they'd been seeking and begin the process of settling in for the afternoon. They made it look easy, this business of knowing where you belonged. Tommy, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. When you picture your future, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, where am I in that picture? Dad, what do you mean? I mean exactly what I asked. When you imagine your life with Carolyn, when you think about the house you want to live in and the family you want to raise, where do you see me fitting into that vision? The silence stretched long enough that I began to wonder if the call had dropped. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying a careful uncertainty. I see you being taken care of, safe, comfortable, not having to worry about things that are getting harder for you to manage. Being taken care of by whom? By professionals. People trained to help seniors live their best lives. Not by him, not by his family, not in his house or anywhere near his daily existence. I would be safely managed by professionals while he lived in my house and built his family in the rooms where Margaret and I had built ours. I understand, I said. So you'll think about it? I'll think about it. After I hung up, I sat on the porch swing until the sun began to set behind the pine trees, painting the lake in shades of orange and pink that Margaret had always called God's watercolor palette. The ducks had disappeared, probably into whatever shelter ducks used when day became night. Inside the cabin, I walked through each room slowly, seeing them as if for the first time. The bedroom where Margaret and I had spent countless peaceful mornings, drinking coffee and reading, while the lake woke up outside our windows. The kitchen where she'd taught me to make her grandmother's pancakes, laughing at my impatience with recipes that called for a pinch of this and a handful of that. The living room where we'd played cards on rainy afternoons and talked about everything and nothing, while the fire crackled in the fieldstone fireplace I'd built with my own hands. Every surface, every corner, every carefully chosen detail told the story of a love that had lasted 47 years, and Tommy wanted to sell it to pay for parking my remaining years in some sterile facility where other people would decide when I ate and slept and died. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Marcus Henley answered on the second ring. "Frank, everything all right?" "Marcus, I need you to prepare new documents. Tonight, if possible." "What kind of documents?" "The kind that ensure my son understands that taking care of family means more than warehousing inconvenient parents." I drove back to town in darkness, my headlights cutting through the October night like purpose made visible. At home, I found an envelope on my front porch, my name written across it in Carolyn's careful script. Inside was a thank you note on expensive stationery, decorated with watercolor flowers that looked like they'd been painted by someone with actual talent. "Dear Frank, thank you so much for sharing your beautiful Lakehouse with us for our wedding reception. It meant everything to Tommy to celebrate in a place that holds such wonderful family memories. I hope someday our children will love it there as much as he did growing up. With gratitude and affection, Carolyn." At the bottom, she'd added a postscript, "P.S. I found some old photo albums in the bedroom closet when I was looking for tissue paper. Such lovely pictures of Margaret. I put them back exactly where I found them. I read the note twice, focusing on that casual mention of searching through Margaret's belongings. Not malicious, probably, but revealing in its assumption that my wife's private things were available for casual browsing by virtual strangers. The composition notebook lay open on the kitchen counter, and I added another entry. October 30th, phone call from Tommy regarding downsizing and future living arrangements. Clear attempt to acquire both properties while relocating me to institutional care. Below that, I wrote, "Found note from Carolyn indicating she'd searched through Margaret's personal belongings during wedding reception. Boundary violations continuing." The next morning, I met Marcus at his office at 8 o'clock sharp. He had the documents ready, a comprehensive revision of my will that included specific conditions for inheritance, detailed instructions for property management, and provisions for charitable donations that would honor Margaret's memory in ways our son apparently couldn't imagine. "Are you sure about this, Frank?" Marcus asked as I signed the final pages. "These changes are significant. Once they're filed and witnessed, they can't be undone easily." "I'm sure. And you understand that when Tommy learns about these modifications, there's going to be considerable family tension?" I thought about Margaret's photo albums being rifled through by someone looking for tissue paper. I thought about my son discussing the sale of our Lakehouse like it was a stock option rather than the repository of our life's happiest moments. I thought about the casual way he'd suggested I be managed by professionals while he built his future on the foundation of everything I'd worked to create. "Marcus, the tension is already there. I'm just making sure everyone understands the terms and conditions." That evening, I called Helen and asked her to join me for dinner. She arrived carrying a casserole that smelled like comfort and wearing the expression of someone who'd been waiting for this conversation. "You've made your decision," she said as we settled at my kitchen table. "I have. And Tommy gets to choose what kind of son he wants to be, but he doesn't get to choose the consequences of that choice." Helen nodded slowly. "Margaret would approve. How can you be sure?" "Because she spent 47 years teaching you the difference between love and enabling. She never let you get away with taking shortcuts when it came to important things." Helen reached across the table and patted my hand. "This is an important thing, Frank. Maybe the most important thing you'll ever teach him." After Helen left, I walked through my house, with locks that answered to my keys and rooms that belonged to my memories. In the garage, I found the bottle of Jameson that Tommy had given me for my birthday, still unopened in its fancy box. I carried it to the kitchen and poured myself exactly one finger, no more, no less, in one of Margaret's good crystal glasses. I raised the glass toward her photograph on the mantel. "To boundaries," I said aloud, "and to the people who love us enough to enforce them." The whiskey tasted like smoke and promises, burning just enough to remind me that some things were worth the fire. Outside, the October wind rattled the windows of the house I'd built with my own hands. The house where I'd raised a son who thought he could manage me out of my own life. But wind passes, and houses built on solid foundations endure. Tomorrow would bring new conversations, new attempts at persuasion, new tests of the boundaries I'd finally learned to defend. But tonight, I sat in Margaret's chair with her memory and my resolve, knowing that some lessons could only be taught by fathers who'd spent too long being taken for granted. The grandfather clock chimed 11 times in the hallway, marking another day in what had become a very different life than the one I'd been living just 2 weeks ago. But different, I was beginning to understand, wasn't always the same thing as worse. Sometimes different was exactly what love looked like when it finally remembered how to protect what mattered most. The phone stayed quiet that night, and the silence felt like peace. If you want a different ending, type change.